full screen and let me show her the full view of everybody. So it's another sold out night as well. So here are your adoring.
Hi
everyone. Hands. More this way.
Oh, more people. Oh my gosh. Hello.
Let me make sure you're turned all the way up. Sorry, I'm used to being the background first.
Oh, it's okay. Take your time.
Okay, we're all set up. Okay, so yes, thank you so much for joining us again, a second night in a row.
It's my pleasure, honestly. I just wish I could be with you all tonight. If they're eating the same thing as everybody ate last night, I am so jealous.
Oh yes, and I can show you, so last night I was only able to show you the flan, but tonight I can show you the first cocktail and the pozole, because I haven't finished it. Oh, and the enchilada. Oh my gosh, we can do such a show and tell. Okay, so this is the cocktail, the first course cocktail.
What a view. Come on.
It's so good.
We're in person.
Here is the, oh God, I don't want to be this on the computer. It's very good.
That looks amazing.
And here is, I mean, not the most photogenic drink, but there you go.
Amazing. Buen provecho, everybody.
Okay, let me make sure this is all turned up. It sounds quieter than it did last night. Sorry. Can you guys hear her okay? Yeah. Okay, great. Okay. It's just me being a little self-conscious. Okay. Here we go. Okay. So again, thank you for joining us. I don't know if you saw one of the comments that I sent to you last night was that after reading this book, like I would like to lobby hard for you to be the Mexican Alice Hoffman as far as like a world of books being written.
Like the Kanyas verse.
Yes. Yes, exactly.
I too would love that.
Well, I think you got at least like 70 pre-orders for whatever that iteration is. Okay, so we took questions from the audience tonight. They are a little bit different than the questions last night. There's some overlap, so hopefully we can keep it mixing up a little bit. But primarily, let's just kick it off. Tell us about how this book came to be. What gave you inspiration? How'd you get into it? All that.
So this book actually came to me out of getting knocked on my ass by rejection. So I wrote fantasy for many, many years before I wrote this book. I got my agent with a YA fantasy manuscript. We took that out on submission, which for the uninitiated means agents send the book to different editors at New York publishing houses. I received a lot of rejections. I wrote another book. Am I still with you right now? Did I lose you?
No, I just maximized your screen.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
You're all gone.
Like I said, I'm usually a background person.
Yeah, that's fine. All right. So I had another manuscript go out on submission, and I received rounds and rounds of rejection. And I was actually on my honeymoon in Mexico City in the fall of 2019 when I received a particularly heartbreaking rejection. And I was having a grand old time, like on my honeymoon. I had lived in Mexico City as a kid, and I hadn't been back in like 20 years. So this was like definitely rain on my parade. I cried in public. And as my husband was comforting me, he was like, okay, you got to get back in the saddle, got to get back on the horse. And so I thought, well, I've always known that I had a haunted house book in me. And I thought to myself, well, I could either keep doing the same thing, you know, writing the fantasy and getting all those rejections, or I could pivot. And a few nights later, I was actually lying awake in the middle of the night, unable to sleep, and there was a thunderstorm, as there often is in Mexico City at this time of year. There are like such great thunderstorms during the rainy season in Mexico. But I was kind of just like laying there in the dark, listening to the rain, trying to fall back asleep, when this voice came into my head narrating what I knew was the beginning of something new. And so I like snatched my phone so fast off the bedstand and started like typing as fast as I frantically could before that voice could slip away. And what the notes that I typed in my notes app became the first chapter of the Hacienda. For me, I can't really start a project until I like have a sense of the voice. I usually know who's going to tell it. I usually know quite a lot about the main characters, actually, except in this book, one of the main characters in particular really surprised me. But I usually can't dive in, even though I'm very much a big plotter. I love having very detailed outlines ahead of time. I can't get into it and start like on page 1 until I have a sense of the voice and the way the story will be told. So it was thanks to a really stinging rejection, I think, that got those wheels moving and made what was kind of not a very fleshed out idea at all. It made it happen. So
sorry, getting used to all of the controls. Sorry, still getting used to them. Thank you. One thing that you just said reminds me of another thing you said last night that I want to ask an unscripted question. Hopefully that's okay, and your publicist won't get too mad at me.
Put me in, Coach. I'm ready.
So you mentioned that previously you've mostly written fantasy, and that this is your first foray into horror that we the published public has seen. So I'm curious, what was different, or what is different about your approach to writing fantasy versus horror, and are you still drawn to fantasy, and what might we see from you?
I love this question. I love talking about this. So I think, the Hacienda is both horror and a historical novel. And I have found that the differences between writing fantasy and writing historical fiction are there's not like a huge gap to bridge there, because they require a lot of the same skills. While with fantasy, you're dealing with world building, like with magic, with magical schools, with elves, with what have you, in creating a coherent system, a coherent world that the characters populate and the reader just gets drawn into. You kind of do the same with historical fiction. The places from which you draw inspiration are different, and the ways that you use the inspiration are different, but you have to be judicious in the amount of detail that you do include in the book, because I think we've all read those historical novels where you're like, wow, the author really did their research and they really want me to know it. Like there is just maybe a little too much detail going on that's getting in the way of the story. So in that way, historical fiction and fantasy are very similar. Horror in particular was a bit of a departure for me. And it taught me a lot. I think compared to the kind of fantasy that I like to write, writing horror really required me to be emotionally vulnerable with myself in a way that I hadn't asked of myself before. It really requires you to look inward and think, okay, well, what does scare me? What do I find frightening? Is it a loss of autonomy? Me, yes. Big old control freak here. Is it a fear of the dark? Also, yes. There were definitely nights when I was drafting this book when I had to sleep with the lights on. But on a very like nitty-gritty craft level, which is something I love talking about, so I'm so glad you asked this question. On like a prose line level, writing horror demands that you are super precise with the language that you choose. Because what you want to do when you're writing horror is create the kind of experience that a reader or a consumer of media might have, like when they're watching a scary movie. But you do not have jump scares. You do not have lighting. You do not have spooky music. And so everything has to come, all of those feelings have to come from just black words on a white page. And so it actually it's very challenging, and it really pushed me to grow in ways as a writer that I didn't anticipate. And I think if any of y'all are writers, I highly recommend having a stab at horror once in your lifetime, because you realize that what you're trying to do as a writer is make the reader feel something in particular. And if you write romance, that's like suspense or yearning. And if you're writing horror, that's fear or that's dread. And you have to like really focus on the words you use to control them so you can try and affect the reader in certain ways. So it it was difficult. I enjoyed it. It was a challenge that I really sank my teeth into, and just I'm in the final stages of editing my next book right now, and I was just working on a scene that required a little more scary stuff. And so I was infusing more and more scary stuff into the scene, and it was just so much fun. So I think for the second part of your question, I love fantasy. I absolutely have projects that I'm dying to return to. But what I think I'm going to do next, and this is between us, but I have a book that is going to be coming out at some point in the near future, that marries the gothic horror of the Hacienda with fantasy. So kind of bringing my two loves together. So I'll never really leave fantasy behind, because let me tell you, I'm very tired of writing historical fiction at this point. The research is a lot, and sometimes it can be very tricky and labor intensive in ways that kind of burn me out a little bit. And I also just finished my PhD in history, so I'm really burnt out on the history right now. So yeah, I think I'll definitely return to fantasy. And yeah, you heard it here first. More fantasy is definitely coming from me.
Sorry, my mouse is now trying to right-click everything. Oh God. Oh no. Oh no. Oh no. No, come on. Get there. Nope. Oh, maybe that's it. Thank you. You're so smart. Oh my God. Thank you. Okay. Sorry, my clipboard was hitting the keyboard. I am very excited about any fantasy that you write, especially knowing that it might have some dark edges to it. I did want to. You mentioned that there's a precision of language that's kind of different between each genre. It's not like you write one genre, you don't have to be precise versus another. But there was a passage. I think it's fairly early on in the book when Beatrice is talking to Juana, and right when she's seen the skeleton, and they go to the kitchen, and she there's a line that's that this was a place untouched by men, or a place only for women. That at first I read it and I was like, we tend to read a lot of, or I gravitate towards books that have definitely a very woman first and feminist perspective, and so that's at first what I read. I was like, yeah, stick it, and then that layer of foreboding edges in on it. There's so many layers to it, so I think it was very, very well executed in that regard.
Thank you very much.
No problem. I know we talked a lot about kitchens last night, but I do want to draw back to the aspect of the historical in this book. And as far as precision and detail, this is a part of history that an American audience might not be as familiar with. So what details, the details that you did include about the war, why do you include those details, and are there any historical figures that you especially drew inspiration from?
Yeah, so with this part of Mexican history, the politics were extremely messy. People were backstabbing each other. The government came apart and reformed. There was an emperor. He was deposed in favor of a liberal government. It's a lot. My PhD is in actually medieval Middle Eastern history, so across the world from where my heritage comes from. So dipping into this this political stew was super confusing. So I knew, like I said before, we've all read those historical novels where you think maybe there's a little too much detail. I knew I had to be careful to not include too much. And so what I tried to do was focus on the details that I knew would contribute most to the story. And so one detail in particular, there are two actually that I think I really drew on to build out the world. of Hacienda San Isidro. And the first one was the fact that, and I mentioned this last night, in the Mexican War for Independence against Spain was an 11-year civil conflict that was extremely tumultuous. A lot of men died. It wrecked the economy. And what happened was, at the end of it, there were a lot of women who were left widowed, a lot of women who lost fathers and brothers, and suddenly found themselves in positions where they had more social autonomy than they had had before, and economic autonomy. They found themselves the heads of businesses in cities and the heads of agricultural estates like Hacienda San Isidro, and had the reins for sometimes the first time, and really stepped forward and stepped into those roles. And so when I was reading about that, it occurred to me, like, this is the perfect, picking this particular period of Mexican history allowed for the creation of characters like Juana, who are, like Beatriz, very much interested in securing, she was very much interested in securing her own autonomy, and was able to do so during the years of the war when her brother was away, her father was dead. She was kind of like the lord of the castle at Hacienda San Isidro, and she very much liked that. So that was one detail that I found really interesting, that really fed into building out not just the world of the book, but also the specific characters that populated it. And the other thing I remember reading was, so there's obviously a big subplot with Padre Andres and his background as a mestizo priest, as somebody who kind of occupies a conflicted place in society, where he kind of doesn't belong no matter where he is. And I remember trying to read, and I really wanted to understand how priests would interact with their parishioners in this period, especially when those parishioners were indigenous people. And so I was reading the letters of this one priest who had a small parish in the south of Mexico City in an area called Xochimilco. And that man was so racist. And it was one of those things where I found it so interesting. This man was writing about his parishioners who were of indigenous descent, I believe in the mid-1820s. And so my book takes place in 1823. And in 1821, the same year that the Mexican Republic was founded, there were laws that formally abolished the racist casta or caste system that had been established in throughout the Spanish Americas for, like 200 years, ever since it had been colonized by the Spanish. So even though these laws that dictated how high a person could rise in society, what kind of jobs they could hold, etc., based on their racial makeup, whether that be white, European, indigenous, Black, or any mix of the three. Even though those laws were formally abolished in 1821, I saw in my research that over the following decades, like, those sentiments and the way that people felt about one another did not change, even though on paper it was like, oh no, we're all equal. And I think that's something that's echoed, especially in Latin American societies today. There's a lot of colorism. And so that was one historical detail that definitely fed into some of the conflicts that take place in this book. So that's your historical lesson about the casta system and it being abolished, and only on paper, really.
That's really interesting, and also, such an interesting echo to American society as well. Just because you write a law doesn't mean that the hearts and minds of people are changed, and how long it takes to overcome those things.
Exactly.
It's interesting to position this book kind of right at that outset, and like the kind of natural horror that is. Is a nice echo.
Colonial history is full of secrets.
Yeah.
So, very ripe for the Gothic.
So you mentioned last night a story about an egg that I want to call back to and kind of expand it a little bit. Thinking about that aspect of extra research. Do you have any practitioners? Thank you. My flan has arrived. Do you have any practitioners in your family? Are there any family stories that snuck their way into the book?
So the egg thing. So there is a scene that's buried in the book. Maybe some of you might have just even skipped over it or read so quickly. I hope you were reading so quickly that perhaps it passed by unnoticed. But this is my little Easter egg, but bunch. There's a moment where Andres is recalling a time when he was with his grandmother when he was a boy, and he's watching her heal someone by running an egg over their body. And so I know specifically in Mexican and Tejano or Texan, and I believe some other parts of Latin America, but I'm definitely the most familiar with folk beliefs from Mexico and Texas, that the egg being used to rid somebody of bad energy is a very was kind of a common thing in folk belief. So basically, like, you run an egg over somebody's body, or the curandera or curandero, that is the healer, runs an egg over someone's body, and then you like take it away. And if it goes rotten, then like that's the bad energy taken out of the person's body and transferred to the egg, and then it can go bye-bye. Hooray. So my aunt told me a story where my mom's family is from the Valley in South Texas. And so my aunt told me a story where once she fainted because it gets very hot in the Valley. If any of you guys are familiar with Texas, like, it gets real hot. So she fainted one afternoon, and when she like came to, one of her aunts was like running an egg over her body, and she was like, "Yo, we're Southern Baptist. You're not supposed to be doing this stuff." My great grandmother was orphaned during the Mexican Revolution at the early part of the 20th century. And when she came to the US, she was sent to live with relatives first in Monterrey, I believe. And then she didn't like it and went to the US to stay with other relatives. Those people were Southern Baptist. And so my father is Catholic, which is where all the Catholicism in my book comes from. But my mother is Southern Baptist. And so my grandmother is very anti-superstition. And so like we don't talk about it a ton in my mom's generation, but beyond like cousins on either side of my mom's family, there's definitely some witchiness going on. And I've had really interesting conversations with some really cool women in my family. So it's there.
I do feel like there are always every family has like some story of some witch in their family, be it like way back or recently. I just have like two anecdotes that you might have some interesting responses to based on this book. We were visiting with my family while my grandfather was in hospice last year, and we were talking about his sister June, who apparently was able to, she had premonitions, and they would not elaborate further, only that it meant that June's husband was dead, and we don't talk about it, but it's a good thing he's dead. Yeah.
That's a story. That is a story.
I will happily hand you the rights to that because I don't. It's too much for me to crack. But it was like it's just one of those things where like she did have feelings of premonitions and things that then just become this family lore that who knows what they harken back to. Just very interesting. And then just anecdotally, last night when we were talking about the egg thing, and Sylvia, who is one of our guests last night, she mentioned that her mother still does that. And I kid you not, I could not sleep last night. Partially because of, I would like to say it's because I was still so scared of the Hacienda, which isn't like not true, but mostly it's because of the cocktail at the very last course is a sugar bomb. It's very good, but it's very, very sugary. And I was scrolling through TikTok and saw this woman she was like, I heard that if you put an egg in a sock above your baby's crib, if they're being fussy, they won't be fussy anymore. And apparently it's like because eggs absorb CO2 and it'll help your baby's teething. It was some crunchy bullshit, for sure. But it made me
Algae is very smart. It knew that you were talking about eggs.
Oh God, that's the worst.
My God, that's so funny. But if any of you guys are interested in like reading more about curanderismo, which is folk healing practices, there's a book that just came out that is incredible. It's a memoir by a writer called Ingrid Rojas Contreras, and it's called The Man Who Could Move Clouds. And it's a memoir about her grandfather, who was a curandero, or a witch doctor in Colombia, and her mother, who inherited some of his powers, but it manifests differently in her. And it's so good. It's really good. It's shortlisted for the National Book Award for nonfiction. It's called The Man Who Could Move Clouds. Highly recommend. I'm reading it right now, and I'm moving so slowly through it because the writing is gorgeous, but also the stories are amazing. So if you love that like intergenerational Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Isabel Allende type of story, but maybe have it be a little bit more real, and full of really interesting family dynamics, this book is for you. It's so good. I recommend it to everyone.
That is excellent. Thank you. I've written that down, and we will include that in our author recommendations at the end of the club that we send out to everybody. Excuse me. Okay, so okay, I'm gonna pull. It's hard. I was telling some other people here, since I'm here 2 nights in a row, it's hard for me to remember what are things that we talked about last night that I found really interesting versus like what people here want to hear about. Okay, so do you guys want to hear more about like horror or the writing process? Writing process. Okay.
My fave.
So, can you talk a bit about how this book, like we've heard about where it came from, but can you talk about the process of actually finishing it and that feverish, those spread apart 5 weeks?
Yes. So I wrote this book in 3 weeks in November of 2019, and then in 2 weeks in April of 2020. And the reason there's a gap in between is because I was a PhD student at the time, so I had to go back to my university and teach. Basically, when I start a book, I usually have a very detailed outline, and this book was no exception. There's kind of like, for lack of a better word, a schism among writers that you may see people talking about online. They ask, are you a plotter or are you a pantser? Do you write by the seat of your pants or do you plot meticulously? And I am like a big ass plotter. I am very type A. I like being very organized. I hate facing a blank page. So I always want to know what happens next. And so before I even start writing the first page, I have an image in my head and I have it in my notes of what's going to happen at the end. And I have a strong idea of different character arcs, and I pace my books according to screenwriting beats, or like if you've ever heard of Save the Cat or the 3-act structure, I use all of it. And then I started writing this book, and it chucked all of my planning unceremoniously out the window, because I started writing this book and it was in November, which is National Novel Writing Month, my favorite month of the year, or NaNoWriMo as us writers call it. So I was drafting really, really fast. I was writing like 3,000 or 4,000 words a day, and that is my preferred method of drafting. I like being suspended in a fever dream and living in the world and like just ripping off the Band-Aid and getting the story out as fast as I can and then coming back to edit it. So because of that, outlines are very handy, because when you're writing so fast, I always know what's coming next. I'm like, yep, just following the map. Let's go, go, go. And it was on one afternoon that I was writing in my apartment, and I was just, hammering away at the keyboard, watching the scene that I knew that I was writing about unfold in my head like a movie, and just kind of writing down everything I saw, because that's how I write. And it was a scene where Padre Andres is at Hacienda San Isidro with Beatriz for one of the first times. And it's night. They've just kind of sussed out the situation together. They get a fright and they retreat to the parlor. And I was kind of just writing along. And in my head, I watched Padre Andres walk around the room, pause, pull a piece of charcoal from his pocket, crouch down on the ground, and begin to draw. And I heard a voice in my head, like crisp as if somebody else had spoken it, say to me, "He is a witch." And I lifted my hands off the keyboard. I swear to God, I stood up and I started pacing the living room, because I was like, I did not plan that. But it was just the book could not be what it couldn't go back to what it was before. You know, where Padre Andres was just a priest who was maybe an ally and definitely a side character, not a main character. And yeah, probably pretty hot, but not as important as he ended up being in the final draft. So even though I plot meticulously, writing this book has taught me to leave space for the surprise. It's, I think, one thing that I personally need to work on as a writer is trusting my own instincts and allowing space for me to, you know, make a leap of faith. And that is usually scary to me because I think, well, what if I write it wrong? And that to me is really scary because as a PhD student, I really only had small chunks of time in which to write. And so I taught myself to write as fast and as well as I could in short, compressed periods of time, because then I had to go back to research or teaching. And so now I have all the time in the world. It is my great fortune. I'm extremely blessed and very grateful to be writing full time. And so now I think I need to work on like allowing space for those leaps of faith and maybe writing something wrong the first time. But this book didn't let me do that. There was a little genius or a muse on my shoulder, like the Greek genius, like guiding my hands and kind of pushing me around, leading this book in directions that I didn't anticipate. So writing this book was in one way pretty emblematic of my writing process, in that like I had my plan, I had my research, I had my characters, you know, I had all the pieces in place, and I did my 3,000 or 4,000 words a day sprinting through to the end. But in other ways, it was very different because I had to change the outline dramatically midway through when I found out that Padre Andres was in fact a witch. So it surprised me.
Yeah, that would be surprising to find out that someone that you knew, and I guess at this point maybe loved, was a witch. That would be surprising for anybody.
I swear, I was like walking in circles, like, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? What am I going to do? It was crazy. The writing is really quiet, guys. So when moments like this happen, they're like extremely dramatic.
Were there any other kind of epiphanies you had while writing that didn't end up, like, as far that didn't go along with your plan, that didn't actually end up making it in the book, but you still feel informed the rest of the story?
Oh, I think all the epiphanies were too good to leave out, honestly. I, for example, didn't plan at the beginning that Juana was going to be an illegitimate child. It occurred to me quite late in the book, actually. So that was cool, and that went in. Let me think, what else? Yeah, I think the epiphany about Padre Andres was the one that dominates my memory. But and then Juana not being Rodolfo's full sister. But everything else, I kind of had the pieces in place. I was kind of following, like, I mentioned last night to the other group that I reread The Haunting of Hill House twice before writing this book. I'd reread Rebecca in the middle of writing this book. So I had classics that I was in conversation with that are structurally, my book ended up paying homage to them. I think if anybody picks up The Haunting of Hill House and hears, you know, being walked through the rooms and being like, ah, yes, this is the green room. It is called the green room because it is green. And like in my book, ah, yes, it's the green parlor because it used to be green. Like I had little Easter eggs like that. So yeah, I think the main other surprise would be Juana's parentage, which I didn't plan, but it just kind of made sense.
I think it definitely made sense because she was quite the enigma, and it definitely made her make sense. I think for sure.
She occupies a socially precarious position, and I think when I was writing, I thought of Beatriz and Juana as foils to one another because they both occupy socially precarious positions. Beatriz has lost her father and her social standing and money. And Juana is at risk of losing all of that if it's discovered that she's illegitimate and doesn't actually have the rights to live on Hacienda San Isidro and run it as she does. She could lose everything. So they have a lot at stake, you know, and they both want similar things. They both want autonomy and they want independence and they want to be the masters of their own fate. They just choose different paths to get that.
Very different and yet very similar. For
Yeah,
sure.
we're willing to be a little more cutthroat about that.
So I want to. I don't want to keep you too long, but I do want to turn to a few audience questions. This one is a very different question. We did not get this last night.
Oh, I'm excited.
Okay, so it's very detailed. I'm going to try and read it with the emphasis with which it was written.
All right, I'm ready.
Did Beatrice send him a letter at the end to tell him she was pregnant 6 weeks after they had sex! Exclamation point. And he needs to help raise the baby who will have both his gifts. What can you not say?
I like to leave the ending open for readers' interpretations. Do I have my own headcanon, which is, of course, the only canon because I am the writer? Yes, and I will say that he was extremely close to the backstory that I had in mind. There will not be a sequel at this point in time. My publisher wanted me to work on something else. So it's up to you to decide what the letter says and what was going on. But I was pretty purposeful about mentioning like, oh yeah, my period came at a weird time. How interesting. Yeah, I definitely did some thinking about that. Just in case, you never know. Maybe if this, sells like gangbusters and like there's millions of copies, then my publisher will be like, absolutely give me a sequel. And well, you have a good idea of what direction it might go in.
Okay, well, we will all hurriedly be awaiting those prequels. We actually did answer most of the questions that are here from the audience. So I would love to know just anything you can tell us about your next project and when we can expect it from you. Also, has Hacienda been optioned?
I am not allowed to say. I can neither confirm nor deny. Yeah.
I see.
Yeah. So keep the good vibes going out there because everything in Hollywood has its time. Things rise and fall. Producers move, writers move. There's honestly my experience working with Hollywood thus far is that it's a miracle that anything gets made. So please pray for a miracle.
We will do that, and we'll just if you could tell us about what you're working on now and what we can expect.
Yes. So I am. It's actually sitting on my desk right now. I can't say the title, and I can give you a few details. And I can say that it will be out in August of next year. But if you follow me on socials or sign up to my newsletter, my publisher said I'll be able to announce things hopefully at the end of the year. We were meant to announce things in November, and I am late on this deadline because writing this book has been very different from writing the Hacienda. It's structurally very different. But in many ways, it's quite similar in that it takes place in a 19th century Mexican setting. In this case, 1846, at the beginning of the Mexican-American War in South Texas, in the Valley, which is where like I said before, my family is from. Like the Hacienda, it has elements of horror, of course. In this case, we're not dealing with a haunting, but instead, some really, really scary creatures that draw on the legends of El Cucuy or El Cuco, who is the boogeyman in Latin America, and low-key some chupacabra kind of vampirism vibes that are going on there. And finally, it also includes a healthy dose of romance. In this case, it's not as much of a forbidden romance as Beatriz and Andres, though I will certainly write that dynamic in the future because I love it. But in this case, it is the story of two childhood best friends who are very much in love, even though they come from different social classes, and who are separated by a tragedy for 9 years. And when they come back together in 1846, when they're adults at the beginning of the Mexican-American War, when their rancho is threatened by both American expansion and these really scary creatures out in the night, they have to work together to save their home. And maybe they fall in love in the process. Of course they do. So I love it. It has cowboys in it, Mexican vaqueros. So there aren't any hot priests, but there are definitely some cute boys and chaps. So
Arguably hotter than hot priests, considering they're way more
honestly, like I went for the indulgence. I'm a former horse girl, so it was like there are horses and there are hot boys in boots and chaps. So I'm really like I'm coming to a point where I'm really falling back in love with it because if any of y'all are writers, you know that revising a book again and again and again, especially when you have a deadline, can sometimes be a little demoralizing. But I'm at a point where I'm like, I just edited a kissing scene, and I'm like, yeah, I like this book. There's more kissing than the Hacienda, I will say that.
The one critique we had was like, where's the sex? We want more sex. We want more.
I'm working on it, y'all. I was raised so Catholic. I'm working through some stuff, but I'm trying to get better at it.
Well, if you need to work through any smut, we'll read it. I mean, it's in all honesty, like I do think if there. In the Hacienda, we do have to remember that this is the 19th century, and they are like very different. So, like, I feel like it was understandable, but the tension was so there that you're just like, come on, you guys, just do it.
Yeah, I get that, and I think the tricky thing when you're writing horror is that like I love putting romance in everything I write. It's just what I enjoy. It's like what I love reading. It's my escapism. I eat that shit for breakfast. But when you're writing a horror book that has a romantic subplot, it's like, yeah, these characters need to bone, but also there's like threat of imminent death. So how do you balance these things? The stakes are a little different than your average historical romance. It's like, yeah, I really want to kiss you, but also they're monsters. So
yeah, maybe this is not the time. Not the time.
Yeah, and also, so it's like trying to figure out like where are their breaks. So like in the Hacienda at the end, and also I wanted to leave on a bittersweet note. So, and tonally, it had to like fit with the rest of the book. I think if I had like a super explicit sex scene thrown at the end, it kind of like you want intimate scenes like that to like vibe and flow with the rest of the work. So for the Hacienda, I'll leave it to the fanfic writers. May they flourish. But yeah, we'll see with future stuff. I'm getting braver and braver.
Well, I think, all look forward to everything that you have to bring in the future. Thank you so much for joining us. It was a joy. Your book is a pleasure, a horrific pleasure. And thank you so much. It was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It really, this has been an absolute delight. I have enjoyed this so much.
As have we. Have a good night.
You too. Enjoy your cocktails and fun.